You've heard quite a bit about cryptocurrency by now, but the true potential behind its underlying technology is staggering.
Namecoin is a currency that runs on the same kind of software as Bitcoin, but it has one notable difference. You can register domain names with it. Because both Namecoin and Bitcoin are decentralized, meaning no central entity controls them, when you register a domain with Namecoin, it is resistant to being hijacked or shut down.
Daniel Kraft is the lead engineer at Namecoin and has been involved in cryptocurrency development since 2013. A former senior developer at Google Zurich, he co-founded the Zyga project, a blockchain gaming platform.
We want all aspects to be on the blockchain, including the assets, but also including all the validation of all the all the game logic.
Don't let the coin distract you. The story of the blockchain is still being written. Let's hear from one of its authors.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your interest in my talk, which will be a bit about cryptocurrencies, a bit about what it missed, and mostly about Namecoin and potential other applications of the underlying technology, like the blockchain. Maybe from a bit of a different point of view than it was hyped like a lot of times. So, well, this is the Namecoin logo. And some years ago, we had quite some arguments in the community about just the right color for it. So I wanted to include it at least once in the slides. But so this is the outline of my talk today. So I first want to introduce you about what blockchain actually is, what the technology is, what it is all about. So what you can use it for and what actually the innovation is all about. Then I will talk about Namecoin itself, like how you can apply that to not do cryptocurrency, but do names and name registry and other applications on a blockchain. And then I want to talk about like actual use cases for this name registry on a blockchain. So, of course, I guess most of you have heard about Bitcoin. So that was introduced in 2008, and the blockchain started in 2009 by pseudonymous developer Satoshi Nakamoto. And it was called, actually in the original white paper, that's the title, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. So it's really meant to be a system where you store balances of money, like just a global ledger of account balances. And that works just completely peer-to-peer in a decentralized way without any central authority. So one important concept here is addresses. So instead of names of accounts, those balances on the ledger are assigned to and are owned by addresses, which are more or less public keys in a crypto system. So that, for instance, if I own 5 Bitcoins, then I can then send them to you by creating a special message that says, okay, I own 5 Bitcoins at my public key this and that, and I want to send 3 of them to this other public key and keep 2 as change, and then I can sign it by my private key, so everyone can actually verify that it was me and that I authorized this transfer. So, but the main point about Bitcoin and the really revolutionary thing that enabled just something that was not possible before is that it works completely without any central intermediary, without any central bank or whatever that keeps a database. But that is done in a fully decentralized way, peer-to-peer. So there is no point for censorship, no central point of failure. So the key thing that Bitcoin solved is called the double spending problem. Because, of course, like what I said before, you own balances by public keys, and then you can sign messages to authorize the spending of it. But that is something that existed long before. And the really interesting thing that was solved is this. Like, let's imagine that Mallory has 1 Bitcoin, and she creates a message that says, here, I want to send my Bitcoin to Alice, signs it with her key, it is valid, that's the transfer. But obviously, she can do just the same and just sign another message that says, here's my Bitcoin, I want to send it to Bob instead. And then the question is, like, obviously not those two can be valid at the same time, because then Mallory would have created 1 Bitcoin out of thin air, and That's not what should be possible, obviously. So the question is how the network can actually prevent that, and how the network can actually figure out which one of those transactions is the correct one and which isn't. So there needs to be some way to say, okay, the transaction to Alice was actually first, so that is valid, and then afterwards the transaction to Bob is not valid anymore because Mallory doesn't own a Bitcoin anymore, so she cannot create a message that sends 1 Bitcoin to someone else. But the important thing here is that we need to reach a consensus in the network without any central instance that tells us what it is about which transaction was actually first. And that is the key innovation that was solved by Bitcoin first, and that enabled the full system to actually work the way it works. So, like I said, the main innovation of Bitcoin is the blockchain and this particular application, this particular algorithm, or sometimes it's called Nakamoto consensus, which basically means that we can, in a decentralized network, reach a consensus about the absolute order of transactions, which transaction was first, so that we can then filter out the second and say, okay, that is the one that is invalid and not the other. And by doing so, we create a list of transactions where you can basically just add new transactions at the end. So you get an essentially append-only list of transactions. That is basically what the blockchain is. And but you cannot go back in time and say, actually, replace that previous transaction by a conflicting other one, because the order is fixed and the order is agreed upon by the whole network. And that solves the double spending problem that I had before in a decentralized way. And mining, that is something you often read about in articles about Bitcoin or hear about in videos or something. You often hear things like miners are powerful computers that validate transactions and get rewarded in new Bitcoins for it. That is what I would say not quite true, because obviously miners do validate transactions most of the time, just as everyone else on the network does, because it is a trustless system. But the true thing that mining does for the network is that it establishes this time order of transactions. That is the unique thing that actually then enables Bitcoin to work in the way that it works. And it's not just about verification. So maybe some of you have seen that before, and it was already mentioned in the introduction video and in the introduction of my talk. Currently, what most people do with blockchain, or when they think about blockchain and Bitcoin, obviously it is about currency, it is about speculation, it is about trading, it is about financial uses of blockchain, like maybe not just digital currencies themselves, but then you can put, I don't know, securities on the blockchain, you can trade them peer-to-peer, you can speculate. So there were actually, in the time since I've been involved in the field, there were actually 2 periods where a big hype was around Bitcoin. I mean, you can see it around 2013, like the first surge in the graph, and then 2017, 18, the second one. And those times were actually also times when a lot of projects and new projects, new blockchain communities, whatever, were created. In the first hype, it was mostly just copies of Bitcoin that had some parameters tweaked, that had some names changed, and then they were sold as some cryptocurrency with a specific use, which is obviously silly because cryptocurrency should have a network effect, and if you have one that everyone uses, then that's useful. But if you then artificially try to say this is a currency for use in games and this is a currency for use by the people of Iceland or whatever, then it just doesn't make any sense. But that was the first spur of alternative blockchain use, and which was basically just currency again and nothing else. And the second wave of new projects, about 1.5 years ago, was with all these ICOs that came up in that time, in the last big price increase of Bitcoin. And for those, it was mostly about, at least that's my impression, it was mostly about people who just learned about blockchain, who just learned that this is like the next big thing, and there's a lot of money to be made there, and it will solve like all the problems magically or something. So they just said, okay, here's a problem. Let's build a blockchain for it, and let's raise money, and let's do this. So there we had a lot of apparent use cases and different applications and whatever of the technology. But in my opinion, a lot of those actually don't need a blockchain at all. And a lot of those people actually just don't understand what blockchain is about. And so they try to do projects that are not cryptocurrency, that claim to use blockchain, but that actually do not. And with this, now let's come to kind of the main topic of the talk, which is Namecoin, which is a pretty old alternative use of blockchain, which is one where the blockchain actually makes sense, as I will try to convince you, and which is not a currency. So it is one of the few projects that fall in neither of these alternative categories. So here's a concept called Zucco's triangle sometimes, which means that if you have a naming system on the internet or on a network or whatever, then you have three attributes: decentralization, security, and meaningful names. So what that means is you can have something that is, say, decentralized and secure. For instance, cryptographic keys, like your SSH fingerprint or your TLS certificate or your Bitcoin address or your Tor Onion service address. These are obviously just a decentralized system because it just creates random numbers. It is secure and is globally unique because it is very, very, very unlikely that someone creating a random key will hit exactly yours again. But it's just like a random string of numbers, so it's hard to remember for humans and hard to use. Then you can have something that is like globally unique, that is secure, and that has meaningful names like the DNS system or DNSSEC or anything where you basically have a central registry of names that keeps track of, like, okay, this guy registered that name and that other guy registered that other name. But it's not decentralized, at least these systems are not, because you need a central table that keeps track of the registrations. And then you can have something that is decentralized, that has human meaningful names, but then it's often hard, or in a lot of projects, that was built in a way where you have, say, a web of trust, where everyone kind of has their own view of the world and sets up their own root zones of the naming system. So it's not absolutely guaranteed that one name resolves to exactly the same thing for everyone. And then you can have Namecoin and some other systems that came later that use kind of the same idea that actually has all three properties. So how do you do that? Well, the basic principle is whoever registers a name first gets to use that name. I mean, that's straightforward and that's simple. But then the question is how you can actually do that in a decentralized way. That is the big problem to solve in order to build such a naming system. But that is basically the same thing that we had with the double spending problem before. By using a blockchain, by using proof of work mining, as in Bitcoin, you cannot only just time order the spending of Bitcoins, but you can also time order the registration of names. So you can establish an absolute consensus about the time order of actions in the system, which means that you can actually reach a consensus of who was the first that actually wanted to register that name, and that guy gets to use that name, basically. And that means that the name, just like a Bitcoin balance, is owned by an address as a cryptographic key. The name is owned by and is assigned to an address on the Namecoin network. And so there is also a key pair that can be used to control that name. And that is also very interesting, very important, because that way you can build a system so that basically the owner of a name who holds the private key to the address that owns that name is allowed to make changes to the name and, say, store some value in the name, like, for instance, what you do if you add an IP address to your DNS zone or something. And everyone else on the network can look up all the names, so all the data is public. But also because there is this address, it is public private key pair in the system, that also means that when I look up a name, then I'm guaranteed that the value I get is actually correct and it cannot be faked because it was created and it had to be signed by the private key of the owner of the address. In Namecoin specifically, there is also this property that names expire after about a bit less than a year, so that, I don't know, if someone loses the key, which I heard happens from time to time in cryptocurrencies, then the name is not lost forever, for instance, and that you need to pay kind of renewal fees like for ordinary domains to keep domains active, just to get an incentive for people to actually use their names, and if they don't want to make use of them, that they let it go so someone else can use them. So basically Namecoin itself, the core blockchain, the core underlying technology, is just a decentralized key value storage system. So that is the core technology. And then how you can use that key value storage system in various use cases, that is kind of a second topic or a follow-up topic. So maybe a bit of history also for it, because I think that's interesting in that that's something that very few people know anymore at this time. So Namecoin is quite old. In late 2010, some people in the Bitcoin community, which was like very different at that time than it is today, they Bitcoin was not really known outside the core circle of people who were active at that time, and also governments and regulators didn't really care about it at that time, or maybe didn't even know about it yet. So at that time, people feared that, for instance, if Bitcoin would get a bit bigger over time, and if governments would actually notice, then they might crack down on it, and regulators might try to crack down, and websites for Bitcoin services could be censored through the domain name system. I think around that time it was also that some websites were actually censored in the DNS because of things like WikiLeaks and torrent tracking and so on. So it was somewhat justified to say maybe that could happen to Bitcoin. So the idea came up to use the blockchain of Bitcoin, or a blockchain similar to Bitcoin, to actually create a domain name system that you could use as an alternative to the DNS, so that it could not be censored by governments in an event of a crackdown on Bitcoin. And actually Satoshi Nakamoto himself and a couple of other big players at that time, or big developers, contributed to that discussion directly. And then in January 2011, Aaron Swartz, the hacker and the activist, proposed a system that was very similar to that BitDNS idea. I guess it was kind of independent, kind of also inspired by Bitcoin itself. And in April 2011, Namecoin was actually created, the blockchain started, the software was released, also by a pseudonymous developer called Vince D. And it was actually the very first blockchain besides Bitcoin. So that is what few people know at the moment. Because, for instance, Litecoin, which is one of the top cryptocurrencies at the moment, and also one of the oldest, but that was created after Namecoin. But Namecoin was always created not as a currency, not for speculation, but mainly to solve this purpose of having a decentralized domain name system, which is also the first application that I want to talk about, namely to actually use Namecoin as a decentralized domain name system. So if I register a name on the Namecoin registry of names that has the special form d/Bitcoin, that was actually the first name created on the blockchain, then we can say this corresponds to an entry in a virtual DNS root zone for the .bit top-level domain. And if I have the Namecoin software running, and I have a browser that knows how to do Namecoin, then I can go to a domain that's called bitcoin.bit, and then instead of querying my actual name servers, my browser would look up in the Namecoin blockchain if there is a name d/Bitcoin, and if there is, it would read the value stored there for the name and use that to resolve the website or show the website in some way. And the value that you store to that domain, that could be, for instance, just the forwarding to some existing URL if you want to. It could be an NS record, basically, Or it could just be the IP address directly, like the A or quadruple A record for it. And it can also, for instance, store the fingerprint of your server, like a TLS-A record. And the nice things about using Namecoin for domain names is, I mean, obviously there is no central point of failure. There is like no one like ICANN that can censor your domains if they want to, because no one is in control. It's a fully peer-to-peer system. But also, the lookups can be done locally. If I have the Namecoin blockchain, then I have all the data I need for it on my computer or on my system, in my client. So if I want to look up a name, I don't need to talk to any name server or any like root top-level domain name server to look it up, but I can just do the lookup locally, which is very fast. And it also means that no one can actually track what domains I look up, what domains I'm interested in. And also, like I said before, the value stored with a name is can only actually be stored there if the transaction storing that value is signed by the private key corresponding to the name, which I can verify as a user. So basically, that gives us DNSSEC in a decentralized way automatically for free in the system. A second very interesting application, which I personally like quite a lot, is that you can use Namecoin also for pseudonyms and identities. So I can have a name that is ID/something, and then that is my Namecoin alias, Namecoin online identity, whatever. And then I can decide to store some data on the value of that name that everyone can look up. If I want to, I mean, all the data is public, but if I want to, I can store my email address, I can store my website, whatever I want on my kind of public profile. But also, I can store, for instance, cryptographic keys. Like I can store my Bitcoin address on the value of my online Namecoin name, so that if someone wants to send Bitcoins to me, they don't have to get the address from me and maybe worry about mistyping it or getting it manipulated by an attacker on the system or whatever. But they just could tell their Bitcoin wallet to send the coins to Daniel, and then that looks up in the Namecoin blockchain what is actually the address of Daniel and sends the coin to a name rather than an address. Or you could use it for fingerprints of, say, GPG keys. So if I want to establish a secure end-to-end encrypted communication channel with someone, then a big problem there is that we need to exchange the public keys. I need to make sure that those are actually correct for the person we want to talk to, and not like some attacker fake the key and put their own instead of the real one. And there are various solutions to that, like you can use a certificate authority that verifies that you are the person you claim to be, or you can have a web of trust, like for GPG, but also you could use Namecoin. So if, I don't know, we meet face-to-face and I just tell you, okay, I'm on Namecoin and my name is Daniel there, then you only need to remember that, and we don't need to exchange a public key fingerprint or something. And then you could look up in the Namecoin blockchain for Daniel and see what is my key, and then you can use that to be ensured that that is really the true one. And also, like, this is a bit of a pet project that I did some years ago, and it's not really maintained since then. You can also use that, for instance, to log into a server. Like, because the Namecoin name automatically is associated to an address, to a public key, and to a private key. What you could do is, if I want to prove to a server that I'm actually Daniel, and the server should allow me to access an account associated to my Namecoin identity, then I could just use my private key to create a signature of some challenge message the server creates, and then by that I could prove to the server that it's me and I don't need to use a password or something for it. Yeah. And that is also something very unique and very interesting, I think. That was actually the very first blockchain game created already in 2013 and 14, way a long time before CryptoKitties came up and the recent hype about blockchain gaming. And that is even more complex than all those recent games. Because in HunterCoin, what you can do is you have a kind of a fully decentralized game world where you have those little people that can walk around, that can fight each other, and that can pick up like coins there and can bring them back to like a banking area, and then you can actually earn cryptocurrency in the game. And all that is basically built on Namecoin, in the sense that if you have a name on the blockchain, like a Namecoin name, or a name on the HunterCoin blockchain, which is kind of identical to Namecoin in many aspects, then what that means is that that is your user account. And then you can set values to the name which correspond to the moves you want to make in the game, like your actions. Let's say, move this character to this position, or attack this other character. And so you use the blockchain to get a verified and agreed upon record of what were the actions made in the game. And then everyone who wants to play that game, they can just read the blockchain, can just read all those actions, know that they are correct, that were really created by those people who own those accounts. And then they can, for themselves, compute what is actually the state and who actually got how many coins by playing that game, just by knowing what the rules of the game are and what all these actions were. You can even use one blockchain that is kind of based on Namecoin technology to do the same thing for multiple games. Like you have the blockchain itself, and as I said, it tracks the actions in the game, like the moves made by the player accounts. And then depending on what game it is, you interpret these actions, or you ignore those actions of other games. You only interpret those actions of the games you're actually interested in. And then you can compute two states, one for game A and one for game B. And by doing that, you get a big advantage over like other platforms for decentralized blockchain games, in the sense that if there are, I don't know, 1,000 games on that blockchain, but I personally only play 2 of them, then I don't have to do all the computations for all the games, like I would have to do if it were built on Ethereum, for instance. But I can just ignore all that data for the 998 games and just do computations for those 2 games that I actually care about. By doing that, I can greatly improve the scalability in terms of processing power that I need for it. And since this is a cloud conference, I spent some time thinking about like what you could do on a cloud. And I don't think that I really came up with something great, because I think even what I came up with is more about a peer-to-peer network than a cloud application. But anyway, so what you could use it for instance, is if you want to distribute data to many nodes, like a configuration update or some shared state. Then because of the blockchain consensus, you know that the data is consistent. I mean, it's not very fast, the update, but you know that after some time you have that everyone agrees what is actually the current state. And also the data is signed by design. So you don't need to introduce like on top of the system another key that signs the data so the node can trust it. And also maybe if you need human readable names for something to name your services or whatever, then you could also use it. That is the end of my talk. So what I think you should remember, if you want to remember anything, is that in my opinion, the main thing about blockchain and Bitcoin is not currency, it's not verification of transactions or something, but it is that you are able to use the blockchain to actually reach consensus on the time order of events. And then from the events, you can calculate the system of some state, like the ledger of Bitcoin or the registry of names in Namecoin, and reach consensus on it. And in Namecoin, we use that actually to solve this perceived problem of Sulcos triangle. The model is one where kind of you have an owner of a name that is allowed to write to it, and everyone else can read it. And you can apply this for a decentralized DNS to exchange cryptographic keys for identities, even for online games, and probably a lot of things more. So thanks for your attention.